Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Robin Jackson, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you how to make something called citric acid mozzarella, also known as quick mozzarella. We're going to be going into the ins and outs of how to make this cheese and doing tons of troubleshooting. So to get us started, I first have to get my milk into the pot. So right now I have a couple of cows in milk, so I'm getting a lot of milk, and I actually chose to make the citric acid mozzarella today because the milk that I had in the fridge was a little bit older. I had some newer milk, but I also had some milk in the fridge that was maybe 5-6 days old, and so you can actually see the difference between these two different creams that I'm skimming. That first one kind of was the older cream. It looked a little bit different. It smelled a little bit different than this cream, which I believe was from yesterday. So that's kind of an indication to me that I probably wouldn't want to make any aged cheese with that milk. It's just different. The composition changes have happened in that milk, and so I've opted to make this fresh cheese, this citric acid mozzarella cheese, because I know that I'm going to be able to get it to turn out. I'm not going to be having problems later on when I'm trying to age a cheese and seeing that, oh, I should have used fresher milk. So the first thing that I do in the morning after I skim off the cream from these milks, and I already had fresh milk from this morning's milk in the pot, is I dump all of my milk into the pot, and then I get some citric acid into there. So at this point I haven't heated the milk at all. I'm just going to add my citric acid in, so I dilute it in a little bit of water. So usually the recipe, like for example my recipe, calls for diluting it in a 1/4 cup of water. I have about 9 gallons of milk in the pot, so I just am diluting it in about a cup. The point of the water is just to make sure that you're getting it to disperse throughout the pot. So I've got my citric acid all diluted there, and the amount of citric acid that you add is important because this is going to lower the acidity of the milk into a very specific acidity point, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But mozzarella, you really need to get it into a very specific acidity point to get it to stretch properly. So I add the citric acid in while my milk is still cold. Now if you accidentally heat up your milk and then add it in, what's going to happen is it's actually going to turn into ricotta. So it's really, really important that you're making sure that you add this the citric acid in while your milk is still cold. Now sometimes I will accidentally start heating up my milk and then remember my citric acid. I'll add it in because I'm like, oh, it's not that hot yet, and I will notice that even though it doesn't coagulate the whole pot, I still end up with a few little ricotta bits in my mozzarella. And so you're just going to have better mozzarella if you make sure that you're adding that in when the milk is still cold. Now after I've added this in, I'm going to start to warm the milk up over medium-low heat to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So I just use a little pasta spoon and I pop my thermometer in there, and I'm just going to like wash my milk dishes and get everything done, but come back every once in a while just to stir this. Now if you don't come back frequently enough or you heat too rapidly, what you're also going to have is that ricotta reaction happening at the bottom of your pot, and especially you can see I'm using this super huge pot. After you've gotten your milk to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, what you're going to do is you're going to add your rennet. So rennet you want to add according to your package directions on your bottle versus the recipe directions, because you can have different strengths of rennet. So I'm adding my rennet in here. You're always going to be diluting rennet in water, in lukewarm water, about that 90 degrees, so it doesn't cool down your pot. So again, I'm just diluting this in some water, and then I'm going to go ahead and add it in once my pot is 90, and that was like perfect. It turned to 90 right as I turned it. Now I'm just going to add this in, and then I'm just going to use some gentle up and down motions to stir this rennet in, and this is going to cause quick coagulation. So I'm going to see coagulation in this cheese pot in about half an hour to an hour, and that's actually perfect because I got to go out and we're moving our beef cows across the road today. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'm going to come back and finish up this recipe. but that's what I'm just going to do for this next hour. So I'm going to put a cover on this pot. I like to use a big piece of tin foil. That just helps me to maintain that 90-degree warmth at this point, and I should have said this before, but at this point the burner is turned off. And so what I'm just trying to do is just maintain that 90 degrees Fahrenheit while I'm out moving cows. And then I'm going to come back in an hour and start to do a few other things, but I will show you guys that. This may be like the weirdest cheese video you have ever watched in your life, but here are the cows. They were supposed to be following the tractor, but then they went a little rogue. Luckily, Zach was able to get around them and they started following the tractor again. So that was good. But yeah, my cheese is just inside coagulating right now, and I'm going to start driving up this hill, and hopefully these cows start to follow me. And here they had run up a different path. They didn't follow me up the hill, but luckily they all ended up in the top field. So now I'm going to see if they will follow me to the driveway and then go across the road. And Zach and Echo are still behind them, just trying to get them to go the right way. And here, finally, we are on the right path. We've got them to the driveway at this point. They're following the tractor. They just like to follow the bale because Zach's been feeding them for the last couple days. And we took them down the road and chased them into the pen, and they'll graze for a while until there's no more grass, and then we'll start feeding them for winter. But now it's been about an hour, and it's time for me to go back to the house and check on my mozzarella because I think it'll be ready to stretch. So back in the house, I'm just going to take the tinfoil off of my pot of milk. It's maintained the temperature pretty good, so it's pretty close to 90 still. And what has happened is the curd mass has actually coagulated, or the milk has actually coagulated, and it's sort of sunk down below this layer of whey. And that is completely normal when you're making mozzarella. It's not more normal if you're making other types of cheese, but totally normal if you're making mozzarella, especially if you're coming back after about an hour. And even though usually you're seeing coagulation at about a half an hour, my favorite time is to come back after about an hour. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut these curds. Now you can go ahead and cut them into a grid pattern, which is usually what I recommend, but this is a ginormous pot, and I actually find that I have a better time, specifically just with mozzarella, if I cut them with a whisk. So this is typically how you cut curds, say for like an Asiago or a Parmesan, and it's going to make more of a drier type cheese, but because I'm not going to be stirring my mozzarella too long, I'm happy to cut them with this whisk just because I know I'm going to get more uniform curds versus trying to go underneath them and get to the very bottom of the pot. So after I cut the curds, I'm just going to put the lid on the pot again and just let them rest for about 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, I'm going to start to turn the heat onto medium-low again and just stir the curds just a little bit. And now it depends on the recipe that you're doing, how much you're actually going to be stirring the curds. But I'm just going to be stirring these curds for like 5 minutes. All I'm planning on doing is bringing the heat back up to about that 90 degrees Fahrenheit because it had dropped down about 5 degrees or so. During the stirring time, I'm just going to be releasing a little bit more moisture from these curds, and this is going to help with the final texture of the mozzarella. You can see that I'm still like in my cow chasing outfit, but I'm just going to stir this for like 5 minutes, get it back up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'm going to test to see if this mozzarella is ready to stretch. Now mozzarella, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit here while I stir. So mozzarella is a very amazing cheese because you can make it in so many different ways. And if you have made mozzarella before, you've probably seen that there is quite a few recipes. Say when you Google it, you're going to see a ton of different recipes. And I've talked about here before on my channel how citric acid mozzarella is just one of the types of mozzarella that you can make. In fact, it's not even my favorite type of mozzarella. My very favorite type of mozzarella is a type called naturally acidified mozzarella. And my recipe for my naturally acidified mozzarella is actually in that Christmas cheese board ebook. You saw me flipping through it at the very beginning of this video. I didn't say that's what it was for, but that actually is what that ebook was. It has my It has tons of different recipes in it. It has brie recipe, Gouda recipe, Colby, naturally acidified mozzarella, citric acid mozzarella. So if you want to check that out, I will link that down below. But different recipes for making mozzarella. Now, when you make mozzarella, I talked a little bit before about how you're actually trying to get it into a very specific acidity window. So what you're trying to do when you are making mozzarella is you're trying to drop the pH of the milk actually into about acidity window of about 5 to 5.4 on that pH line. Ideally, about 5.2 is going to give you the best stretch. Now, I don't test pH in my cheese making, but I will show you a little way in a little bit here in the video. I'll show you a little way of how I make sure that my mozzarella is actually in that correct acidity window. Now, with the citric acid mozzarella, how we are dropping the acidity of our milk is we're actually adding that citric acid in. And so we add the correct amount of citric acid in that the recipe calls for. And theoretically, this is going to put our milk into that correct acidity window. And the longer that milk sits in that acidic environment, the more acidic it's going to come. So usually after about an hour of sitting in that citric acid acidic I don't know if that's how you say it. That's not how you say it. After about an hour of that milk having that citric acid mixed into it, it should be in the correct pH window. So even though I'm stirring this right now, I could actually probably get it to stretch at this point. But I just want to firm these curds up a little bit more, make them lose a little bit more moisture so they're easier to deal with, and so that I'm going to have a better final texture. Now, I kind of liken citric acid mozzarella to a bit of a shot in the dark, and this is where a lot of people sort of struggle with making mozzarella is because you are adding in a certain amount of citric acid, you're adding it into your milk, and you're hoping that that milk actually lands into that correct acidity window. And so there are reasons why it might not land into that window. For example, at the beginning of this video, I showed that I was using some older milk, but I was also using fresher milk. So if you used all of the same age milk, and maybe that milk was a little bit more acidic, it had been sitting in the fridge for a lot longer, you might have more difficulty turning that milk into mozzarella because it's actually going to already be a little bit acidic. And when you add that citric acid in, you could actually be missing the acidity window. Instead of hitting between 5 and 4, or 5 and 5.4, now you're maybe hitting 4.9, and that's not going to stretch. Or maybe you're using really, really, really fresh milk and you're not adding quite enough citric acid in, and so it's going to take longer for it actually to reach down to that 5 to 5.4 range, because the longer that citric acid is in that milk, the more acidic it's actually going to make it. So those are some reasons why you might actually not hit that target point. The reason that I was okay with using older milk today in my citric acid mozzarella was because I was using a really varied age of milk. So all of those are going to kind of balance out any of the acidity, and it's not going to make too much of a difference throughout. So that's kind of how or why I was doing that. All milk sort of comes out of the udder at about 6.8 on the pH line, and so if it has sat in the fridge a little bit longer, it's going to be a little bit more acidic. It might be 6.7, might be 6.6. If you're dealing with milk from an animal that is maybe sick with, like, for example, mastitis, and maybe has a little bit of blood in that milk, it could actually be more alkaline. So you could have milk that's not even on the acidic side of the pH. I'm getting too scientific, I'm sorry. But it could be maybe like a 7, or it could be a neutral. Anyway, so those are some reasons why this citric acid mozzarella recipe might not work for you, but those are things to kind of keep in mind if you are struggling and you are troubleshooting. That's sort of my first spot that I go is it your milk? Do you need to add a little bit more citric acid? Do you need to back off on the citric acid? Do you need to use fresher milk? Do you need to test your cow for mastitis? Do you need to do like a CMT test? So those are all things that I'm going to go kind of be my first stop when I'm starting to troubleshoot why this citric acid mozzarella might not be working for you. Now here I'm getting a little bit cocky. I'm pretty confident that this mozzarella is actually going to stretch because I make this recipe all the time. So I'm actually taking the whey off of these curds, and so I just scoop off because I really can't lift this pot when it's full. It's just too heavy. I can only lift it if it's like half full. So I just scoop the whey off as long as I can without getting curds, and then I throw a fine mesh strainer into the pot, and then I scoop directly out of the fine mesh strainer so that I don't pick up any curds. And I'm just going to go until I've reached the surface of the curds. I've got as much whey out as I can, and then I'm going to test to see if I'm able to get this to stretch with just a little curd. Now, if you were not sure if your mozzarella was going to be ready to stretch yet, just first test if it's going to stretch and then pitch the whey off of the pot. If you also can lift your pot, if you're using a smaller one, then you can drain the whey off just by dumping it off. So that's up to you, but yeah, I can't dump off of this pot, so I have to pitch it off just using a cup. And so after I have pitched all the whey off, this is what it looks like. I've still got some whey left in there, but those curds are all down on the bottom. Now I'm going to test if this is going to stretch. And as I said, if you are not sure if it's going to stretch, you can totally do this before you pitch off the whey because you're going to want those curds to sit under that acidic whey if it's not quite ready yet. So I throw a curd into a heat-safe cup, into a little teacup, and I have boiled a kettle of water. So I'm just going to go ahead and dump some of that water into this cup. And this is just going to tell me if this curd is actually ready to stretch. And so what I'm looking for here is a really nice stretch. If it's stretchy a little bit, but it's not a really, really nice stretch, then I'm going to let it sit under that acidic whey a little bit longer. If it kind of doesn't really stretch at all and it just sort of breaks off into like crumbly little bits, that's my sign usually that the acidity has gone too far, or perhaps you forgot to add in the citric acid and it hasn't even become close. But at this point, it should be starting to stretch at least a little bit, if not this amazing, beautiful stretch. And I was able to get this amazing, beautiful stretch. And what I mean by an amazing, beautiful stretch is that I'm just going to put this on the floor. I'm going to show you, I'm going to put this cup on the floor, and I should just be able to stretch this like almost to the roof. This actually was kind of funny to me because I've never put the cup on the floor when I'm stretching this before, and I was having a really hard time dipping it back down into the whey. You can see the concentration on my face there. I'm like trying to get the end down into the whey. It was like a fair game. Anyways, but what I mean by that is you just want to have like this really beautiful stretch, and that is going to tell you that all of the curds in that pot are ready to have a beautiful stretch, that they're all going to stretch really nicely. And so if you don't get that beautiful stretch, you're going to let them sit a little bit longer because that's just not going to give you that good of a mozzarella. It's going to give you a mozzarella that's more rubbery and just not the texture that you're looking for. So once you know that your mozzarella is ready to stretch, you've done that stretch test, and no matter what recipe you are doing, I really, really recommend that you do a stretch test. That is going to help you make better mozzarella, make more consistent mozzarella. You are going to start to stretch your cheese. And now different recipes will have you stretch your cheese in all sorts of different ways. You're going to find recipes for stretching your mozzarella in the microwave. You're going to find stovetop, just heating it on the stovetop. You're going to find heating up the whey. You're going to find boiling a kettle of water and submerging it in that. So what all of these have in common is you're actually adding heat to all of the surfaces of these curds. And so usually mozzarella is going to stretch to its really best point at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see that I dumped some kettle water in there, and today I'm kind of doing a hybrid stretch model. I end up stretching in all sorts of different ways. I don't have a microwave, so I don't stretch that way. But I end up stretching in all sorts of different ways depending on what I'm doing and what I want to do what I feel like that day. But today I dumped that rest of the kettle of the water in because I already had it for my stretch test. And then I'm also heating the whey in this pot, the remaining whey in this pot up. So I've got my burners both on. They're at like medium low heat, and I'm just kind of breaking up this curd mass so that that heat can hit all of the different curds. And so if you were following a recipe where you had drained all these curds off through, say, a colander, you could cut these curds all up into little pieces, but I'm just going to break them apart so that the heat can kind of hit all of the different spots, and I'm just coming back every once in a while to stir them and sort of break them up a little bit more and get them to be together. As that heat starts to come up to closer to the right temperature, they're going to start to clump together. And so at this point, it can kind of start to be where you start to see a little bit of stretching. You saw that there, that little bit of stretching. And so at this point, this pot is maybe like 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So a lot of times where people struggle with making mozzarella is they actually don't get the temperature of the pot up to a high enough heat. And so they're trying to stretch their mozzarella when it's too cool. And so this is going to create mozzarella that's a little bit more rubbery, that isn't that super silky smooth texture that you're looking for. It's a little bit harder to handle. And when mozzarella is harder to handle, you automatically end up working it more. And overworking is one of the #1 causes of rubbery mozzarella. So making sure that your temperature is actually correct is going to help you to make better cheese. And so here I'm just still coming back. You can see the temperature is getting a little bit hotter. I think it's like 130 at this point. It's all clumped together. I'm starting to see a little bit of shininess, but it's still not ready. And so I'm just going to keep coming back and watching it. At this point, I can't kind of break up the big massive curds, and I wouldn't want to, but I am just like sort of kneading it when I come back to try and get that heat to sort of go into the interior of that mozzarella. And here I'm showing you, it's maybe at like 130 here, I think still, and see how I'm trying to lift it up, and I see that it's stretching, but it's sort of breaking. And so if I tried to work this mozzarella, if I tried to stretch it and make it into kind of my final product, that's where I would end up with that really rubbery mozzarella. So I'm at about 150 degrees Fahrenheit for the water here, and I should say I don't actually usually test the temperature of the water. I usually just go by looks and feels, but I did test it here to show you actually how hot it is supposed to be. But you can see it looks a little bit more shinier, this ball, and it's becoming way easier to handle. It's becoming way more supple. If you heat your water to too high of heat, there's also that risk of your mozzarella just becoming too melty, and that is especially true if you have a lot of moisture left in your mozzarella. It could get to a point that it's really hard to actually deal with. So it's nice if you get it to like that between 150 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see that I am starting to pull this actually into string cheese today. So I've got a bowl of water, cold water here, and I'm just pulling it out of the pot and throwing it into the cold water. And if I tried to do this, say when the water was 130 degrees Fahrenheit, I would be having breaking off pieces. It wouldn't be going in nice and smooth, but you can see I'm having no problem with this. This is just going nicely into the water, and it's just a really nice stretch. And so that is kind of a problem that people sometimes have, is they just don't have their water hot enough, or they have it too hot. So trying to get it into that sweet spot of it's going to be perfect. Now, if I'm making a smaller batch of mozzarella, actually my favorite way to heat it is by pouring a kettle of water in there. You're going to have really consistent results when you pour a kettle of water into your curds. And even though that water is boiling, when it kind of mixes with the curds and then also mixes with the whey that is left in there, it's going to, or the small amount of whey left in there, because you pitched most of it off, it's going to just bring that water probably to that 150, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's going to be warm enough for you. So that's what I do when I'm making a smaller batch of mozzarella, but it just doesn't work when I'm making this big, giant batch of mozzarella here. So you may be wondering, if you have never made string cheese before, you may be like just kind of mind blown right now that string cheese is actually just mozzarella, but that is actually what it is. I always say it's kind of overworked mozzarella, because I would never kind of work a mozzarella ball quite this much. But once you get it going, and if you have a cold bottle or a bowl of cold water sitting next to you, you can just like string the whole thing out, and it's really amazing. It's very fun, and I'll show you in a little bit here how I salt that and deal with it. But I'm going to make about half of this batch of mozzarella into string cheese because it's Zach's favorite. This was actually the very first cheese I ever made was string cheese because Zach is from Wisconsin. We currently live in Canada, but Zach is from Wisconsin, and string cheese is really famous there. So when we first got a milk cow, he asked me to make him some string cheese, and so I obliged, and to this day it's still one of my funnest favorite cheeses to make. I like to make it with the naturally acidified version of mozzarella the best, and that again recipe is in the Christmas cheese board ebook, but this one is also really good. And if you follow all the kind of rules about making sure you're getting the texture right and everything, or the heat right so that the texture is correct, it's going to taste really good. So anyways, I've got half the batch made into string cheese, and the rest of it I'm actually just going to put into a hold form, and it's just going to kind of drain. So I'm just going to make it into like this giant mozzarella ball, like a big huge mozzarella ball, and just shove it into a hold form. And this makes a really good grating cheese. So I will just put it in the fridge, and then I'll grate it tomorrow or the next day. I actually have a 9-gallon batch of mozzarella that's still in the fridge. I was reluctant to make mozzarella today, but I kind of had to, as I said at the beginning of the video, that I didn't want to make an aged cheese just because I had so much mozzarella in the fridge. But I just shredded up and I put it in the freezer, and then we have it for pizza nights. We had homemade pizza last night. Oh, that was hot. I recommend you doing this with rubber gloves or a wooden spoon. Don't do like I do. People are always like, hey, how can you touch that with your hands? I feel like I have burned my hands over like 10 years of making mozzarella. I've burned the feeling out of my hands. I cannot, but I still can tell that that's hot. But I recommend that you use gloves because then you won't burn yourself. But anyways, once I had it in here, I'm just kneading it into a nice big ball. I find that it's kind of easier because it is hot and because I'm not using gloves. It's kind of easier for me to knead it once I get it into the dish. And I was sharing this on Instagram last week because I showed when I was making that big 9-gallon batch of mozzarella, I filled it into actually this container that my little cheese form is sitting in. I filled the entire container with mozzarella. And so I was showing on Instagram how I actually prefer to knead it, a big mass like that, knead it actually in the vessel because it still is warm. It's still going to be able to knead and stretch and mold into its final form. It hasn't cooled down yet, but it just makes it way easier to handle. So you can see here I kind of made it into a giant shiny mozzarella ball, and I've just got it in this form. It doesn't have to be a hold form, so you can see that some water has kind of seeped out, but as I said last week, I just made it into this like container. So whatever sort of shape you have, it's just to form it into a shape. And so now I'm going to go ahead and salt these cheeses. So there are like a bazillion ways that you can salt your mozzarella, and different recipes are going to have you do it different ways. My favorite way is actually just a surface salt, which is all it is you're just putting the salt onto the actual cheese itself. So you can see that I did that for the big mozzarella. I just rubbed a hefty amount of salt onto the surface of the cheese. Sometimes I will later on flip it over and cover the entire thing with salt, but I've actually been finding lately if I just leave it into the cheese form or whatever I'm putting it in, put like a really thick layer of salt on the surface of it, and that salt seems to seep all the way to the bottom, and it does a good job. So I'm using a good amount of salt though. One of the main reasons when people are learning how to make mozzarella, they say, oh, my cheese tastes so bland. Well, mozzarella is a fresh cheese, and other than adding some acidity to it and making it taste a little bit more acidic, it really just does taste like milk. And so the salt is the thing that is going to define the taste in it. So if you are finding that your mozzarella is too bland, start salting it in a different way. And so you're going to see a lot of mozzarella making recipes have you actually add salt in when you're stretching it in the whey. You'll see some where you add it in to the curds before you stretch it. My preference is the surface salting afterwards because that's where you're going to get the most salt in. When you're salting the curds beforehand and when you're adding the salt into the water or the whey during stretching, you're actually losing a lot of that salt in your water or whey. So I find like you get more of it actually into the cheese if you salt it afterwards. You can also salt it into a brine. So sometimes I'll throw it in my 18% brine that I keep for my aged cheeses. For example, the string cheese though does not need long in the brine. Like 30 minutes usually is kind of max that I would throw it into the brine, but I'm going to show you how I just kind of surface salt these string cheeses. All I do is I just chop them up into the size that I want. Sometimes I'll roll the whole thing into like this giant ball, but today I was just going to chop them up into kind of the size that I want, and I'm just going to sprinkle the surface of them with salt, and this is going to kind of seep into them, and they're going to be ready to eat basically right away. And in an hour, that salt's going to be kind of seeped into them, and they're going to be ready to put into a dish in the refrigerator. All right, so that pretty much sums up this tutorial. I'm going to put both of these into the refrigerator. So after the salt seeps in for about an hour on these string cheeses, I'll move them to the refrigerator. This type of cheese is highly perishable. When you add more salt, like with the surface salting technique, they do last longer. So before, when I was always salting the cheese while I was stretching it, adding the salt into the whey, I found that it was only lasting like maybe 3 days or something, and it wasn't really lasting that long. But when I started surface salting or salting with a brine, I found that they started to last way longer. So for example, I said that mozzarella that I have in the fridge was from last week, but I feel like it's from the beginning of last week. So it's like 7 days old at least, and it's still good. So it does last a lot longer depending on how you salt it. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope that it helps you learn how to kind of troubleshoot. I hope that it gives you a general idea of how mozzarella is made. I know it wasn't like a specific tutorial for a specific recipe, but it's just all of the recipes are so similar out there for citric acid mozzarella, and all of them are probably good. Just check out the reviews. I always say, like, if you're going to do a cheese making recipe, make sure that you check that the reviews are okay. But as long as there's no like typos or anything in the recipe, it should work out. As I said, I will link down below my recipes. They're in my Christmas cheese board ebook. And I also forgot I wanted to say, so I have a real live Hold in Your Hands book coming out in spring 2025. It's going to be published through Homestead Living. So I'm so excited for that. So make sure you're on my newsletter list because you'll get a notification when pre-sales start for that. Thank you guys for watching my video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye!